Jazz, thank you very much indeed for joining me on this podcast. We've known each other for such a short period of time, and yet I really do feel that I know you reasonably well, and I'm looking forward to getting to know a little bit more about you. We've
Yeah,
had
we
a
certainly seem to have struck up a resonance.
hmm, well, certainly we've had a couple of exchanges on LinkedIn, and on the strength of that, I looked at your TED talk, which I found brilliant, and I recently attended a webinar at which you were the guest. And your TED Talk, I don't necessarily want to repeat that because what I'd like to do is include in this podcast a link to the TED Talk, which is absolutely excellent. But I'm really interested in so what happens next, because you really do lay the foundations there, and AI is moving at such a pace. I'd be interested in perhaps a little bit of a summary on your TED Talk, but we'll get people to look at that. And then what you're thinking, how it's evolved, where it's going since then.
Yeah, the TED Talk was centered on what a person perceives as being the idea of who they are as a person. And that's very much daily experience through their mental health of themselves and of the world around them. And for a long time, I thought if you want to get a picture of yourself and your nature and who you are, then in a conventional way, if you were going to do that, taking a physical capture of yourself, you'd take a selfie, you know. But I asked the question, well, whether it's possible to look at mental health and the stigma that's associated with it, because it's an invisible thing. How can we make it visible? What would it be like, for example, if we look at conventional ways which people take selfies? Most people don't have a stigma associated with taking a selfie. They're
Mhm.
quite happy to take one and then share it amongst their friends. And I wondered, well, what would it be like if you could take a selfie of your mental health? And if people started sharing that, would we see stigma around mental health go away, and for people to work with one another's mental health in a more constructive way? And especially with regards to creativity, um, if people did that and they supported one another's mental coherence and mental and cognitive kind of congruence as well, then there's a chance that they're less likely to experience the kind of stress which leads to blocks in creativity. And if you have more sustainable creativity, then you're likely to get improved engagement at work, productivity, and ultimately it's something that can even positively benefit the economy of a country. So that was the premise. And I've created technology a long time ago, which is a psychometric. It asks people questions about how well they're meeting their needs, which is a direct correlate of mental health and also a cause. And I took the scores, and in a paint by numbers way, I laid them down on a grid and I turned them into colors. And that heat map that was created is like a colors of the rainbow. Um, it's technically a selfie of someone's mental health. And a person can look at it and they can decide where they want things to be different. Or in my case, I created an AI to analyze that and identify exactly where the center of gravity of the person's needs were, and for them to go and address them. And in the process, stabilize their mind, improve the conservation of energy, have a more clear kind of way of thinking, and ultimately, you know, nurture what's needed for sustained creativity. So that's it in a nutshell.
But you touched on so many things there, and I think it has the potential to be an interesting, if not controversial, topic. So let's just unpack a couple of things and we'll see where we go with them. I think, for example, psychometric testing has been through the ebb and flow of evangelists to cynics. And certainly there are some formulaic approaches to classifying and categorizing people that were embraced wholly as the new paradigm and then quite quickly rejected as not necessarily being efficient or effective. But at the same time, we're living in a world where our ability to get data, to use data, to understand and interpret data is as never before. So, how do you feel about our relationship with data and the pros and cons of classifying, categorizing, and analyzing?
Well, my ancestral background is from the Indian subcontinent, and in my 20s, I first started to engage with transcendental meditation and eventually mindfulness and started teaching that. And the lessons I learned from that were the value of data that comes from the moment. And when you can connect into the moment, you can get a sense of your being as it is in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next moment, it might be different.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at things from that perspective, it's hard to try and contain someone's being for all of time into a type that is output from a psychometric profile. And that for me has always been the problem. When you're typing people and you're classifying them as a particular kind of personality, you're kind of fixing them for eternity.
Mm-hmm.
And the nature of human beings is such that they are fluid in their consciousness moment to moment. And if you want to help a person to make the best of the moment, you need to consider them as they are in the moment, not as they were typed 3 weeks ago, not as they were typed 20 years ago, and then assume that that person's going to be the same thing fixed forever. That's the worst thing to do. You have to work with people as they are in the room, in the moment. And the 2 dimensions there are really important. The current moment and the current space, but also the current context as well. And my psychometric, when I created it, originally I did the same as other people. I created types for people and said, according to this, this is the way that you should be worked with. You could be a logical person or intuitive person. You could be focused on what you're learning, how you're learning things, or who you're learning things with. And through that mix, might be able to determine why you're doing what you're doing. And then I realized something, which was that that moment was what was important to work with. And the information that we had to help that individual was only valid for that moment and at most for that day. A lot of people run around trying to look for their life purpose and identify who they are and then go and try and be that and practice being that for the rest of their lives. What I discovered was actually people need to discover what the purpose is, not of their whole life. They need to discover what the purpose is of the moment that they're in. They need to at least find out what their priority is for the day, you know? And if they can fulfill the purpose of the moment, they can complete the priority of their day, and they kind of rinse and repeat that. They keep doing that day after day. What happens is they begin to notice trends about certain kinds of purpose maybe repeating themselves, coming back over and over again. They might find that they fulfill lots of different kinds of purpose, but all these different kinds of purpose, they all seem to be orbiting one central purpose. Everything seems to pivot around that one purpose. And when I've been working with clients, that's what I discovered. I discovered you can't discover the future unless you've already discovered the present. And if you repeatedly discover the present, you build up enough pixels, so to speak, in the image of your life, and you eventually begin to see, when you join the dots up, I think I know what this is. I think I know what my life is about. But it's an emergent process. You can't just push a button and frame somebody and say, this is who you are, and this is all we're going to work with and how we're going to guide you for the rest of your life. It's actually dishonorable and disrespectful to the fluidity and the flow of human consciousness.
And I think that's such an important point, and there are a couple of areas that I'd like to explore. I think the first, I think you're absolutely right. It's essential that we as humans have the opportunity to reinvent ourselves. And I think that's part of growth, that's part of development. And if we become typecast as one thing or another, what we were in our teens, our 20s, at midlife, I mean, we are better where we're able to evolve. But I'm really interested in also this in the moment thing, because in your TED talk, you talk about, and you've touched on a little bit there, that this tool can be used not just in the moment for individual, but actually for teams. It's ostensibly a tool that helps us understand in the moment culture. And the reason I find that particularly interesting is that people talk about culture as if it was a standard fixed thing. But the reality is that if Fred leaves the room and Mary joins the room, the culture's changed. Culture is a function of the people that are present, the context, and the task at hand, and it will be as dynamic as that. So I'm really interested in what you're saying there about in the moment. And I'm wondering how you see a tool like this being helpful for teams or organizations in understanding behavior and motive and culture.
Well, I think it's important to look at science here, because when you're working in the dimension of time, the very narrow sliver of time that might be the current moment, and the region of space that you're in, you're actually immersed in a field of energy. And this pool, this ocean of energy that you're immersed in, isn't just the kind of energy that powers your phone or turns on light bulbs in your home. It's not necessarily that kind of energy. It's actually an energy which is defining the kind of vibe in the room. It's something that's defining how people interact, the dynamics between them. There's a field of consciousness in the room. And what I find remarkable is that when I was studying science, my first degree was in astrophysics, I was trying to understand energy from an Einsteinian perspective, where he famously, linked energy to matter in his famous equation, E equals mc squared. And it was essentially saying that matter is something that's kind of confined or condensed energy. It's just something that's energy imprisoned, if you like. And I thought that was really interesting, because in the East, in other cultures, people look at matter as actually being the densest form of mind, of human consciousness. And I looked at those two different views and I thought, well, let's take the Eastern perspective that matter is actually mind, a very dense form of it, and let's stick that into Einstein's equation, which is E equals mc squared. Now, E equals mc squared, it stands for that energy is related to matter, and the C is light. So energy is related to matter and light. But matter in the East is considered a dense form of mind. So sticking that into the equation, we now get that energy is related to mind and light. And I always thought, wow, all these technologies are being built out of that equation. Particle physics, nuclear reactors, atomic weapons, nuclear. There's a lot of technologies that come out of that one formula, but they're all based on extracting energy from matter. And I wondered, well, if we built a science but instead interpreted matter as mind, would it be possible for us to create technologies which are built on the principle that energy is related to mind and light? And my technologies that I first built 16 years ago, it took that scientific principle from the West, it combined it with that principle from the East, and it encoded it into artificial intelligence algorithms, which would show people how they could release energy from their minds. And I think it was the first technology I certainly came across that was going to do that. And in the release of energy from a person's mind, the consequence is the person experiencing more aliveness, more vitality, more animation, more clarity, all the lovely things that we really could find helpful when it comes to coaching, whether it's in business, whether it's in sport, or whether it's even guiding leaders in organizations or in countries, for example. It's all about how do you get energy out of people's minds, but also how can you put energy into people's minds too. And in group situations, energy is very much something I would define as something that's linked to the relationships between people. In fact, a long time ago, I defined energy in terms of relationships, and I said that energy is the quantity and quality of relationships within a system and between that system and others. So in a team, in a group situation, as you rightly said, when one person leaves the room, it changes the relationship matrix or dynamics in the room. And if the relationships have changed, guess what? The energy's changed inevitably. And that's what people traditionally call culture. But this, as you've rightly said, is the culture in that moment, in that particular space. But it's all changed because a relationship was removed. And as a result, the remaining set of relationships have to adjust. And when they do that adjustment, there's not just a cultural shift in the room, there literally is a shift of energy in the room. So I think it's really important to look at those kind of dynamics and understand that if we want to look at coaching as a science and we want to try and get AI to be as close to human consciousness and intelligence as possible, the defining factor that will enable us to do that is how we define energy and how we work with it.
I'm reminded of another podcast that I did a short while ago with a rugby referee, and there was bad behaviour on the pitch. And he recalled a story where the referee pulled the opposing captains together and says, "If you don't sort this out, I'm going to tell your mother." And it was an incredibly powerful thing that which this big burly rugby players were very contrite and wandered off. And when we talk about who's in the room, I'm really interested in who's in the room, and because I think we would behave differently if a mother was in the room, or if a policeman with a clipboard was in the room, if somebody who's really close friend with whom we have a strong bond, or if AI was in the room. Because we take our social cues from people we value and we trust. And I'm really interested in the part that AI has, either positively or negatively, because I suspect I would behave differently with a human in the room. I think physiologically, you've got endorphins, etc., that present themselves differently in human to human connection, even differently from you and I having the Zoom conversation. There will be different chemical formulas
Well, what
interacting.
more important is the field. In the
Mm,
end, that's all that matters. The field of interaction is
mhm,
different. The field I have physically with someone in the room, the kind of physics of it is very different
mm.
compared to the physics of me talking to a screen and only connecting to you through the entangled sound energy and visual energy that's been transported over the internet that we're both sharing with. Okay, it's very, very different. The physics of it is simply different. Now, if the physics of it is different, the chemistry will be different, the biology will be different, the psychology will be different, and ultimately the social engagement and interaction will be different.
Now, I find that really interesting because, I mean, a much more simplistic model, but I'd be interested to unpack this. My view is that with the best of intentions, people have a tendency to, I'll be provocative here, lie. Okay, but maybe say embellish the truth when they are presenting on social media, because social media is a tool in which we present, and we will always seek to present the best version of ourselves. We want to be positive, we want to be supportive, and in so doing, perhaps we portray a better image or a better set of circumstances than those that really exist. And I'm interested in that idea of how we present ourselves, because that actually links back very early in your conversation about what's actually happening on the inside.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think how we connect with ourselves is linked to something you just earlier said about AI being in the room. I did an infographic recently looking at coaching situation, which was a tripartite situation where you have a coach, you have a client that brought you in and asked you to coach somebody, and that third person is the person who's the coachee. And if you look at the dynamics involved, the number of relationships that contribute to the field of the room, the field of all those relationships, then it turns out in a three-way relationship like that, a tripartite relationship, each person has got 7 different dynamics or relationships that they have to manage. For example, the coachee has to manage a relationship with the coach. They have to manage a relationship with a client. They have to manage a relationship with themselves. They have to manage relationship with the environment that they're part of, the organizational environment they're part of. They actually have a relationship with those relationships as well. In all, there's about 7 different relationships that they have to work with. Now, as I said before, relationship is directly linked to energy. So actually, there's 7 different kinds of energy that they have to manage. Now, human beings, especially in people who are good team leaders, they over time instinctively and intuitively know how to manage the 7 dynamics there could be if there's a group of 3 people. Now, as the team gets bigger and bigger, the combinations increase. They're not linear, they're geometric. So, for example, if you added another person to that group of 3, it wouldn't be 7 plus 7 plus 7 plus 7. Even in with a group of 3, it's not 7 plus 7 plus 7, it's geometric. So actually, with 3 people, it's 7 times 7 times 7, which is roughly about 350 dynamics that those 3 people collectively are having to work with. That's a huge number of dynamics. Now, when you bring in AI into the equation, let's say we got rid of the client and it's just coachee, coach, and an AI, all right? In that situation, you might think, well, the AI is bringing its own 7 relationships into the equation. That's not true. AI, the data sets, the foundational models, everything that's gone into it, it's been put together. The models, for a start, would have been put together with probably by thousands of people. The data it's using to drive itself has been scraped from billions of people. Now, if you look at all of those relationships that have gone into the AI, I joked at one point that if you were going to bring an AI into a coaching situation, you'll probably need another AI just to manage the complexity of dynamics that are in there. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really important for people to consider because it highlights what the possibilities are when it comes to both risks and opportunities. The AI comes with it can come with bias. It can come with issues which are not necessarily sensitive to fairness or diversity or all sorts of things like that. So those are risks. On the other side, it brings together a lot of uncertainty too. But uncertainty isn't necessarily always a bad thing. AIs on the whole, they desperately, through their makers, try and deliver certainty. But the funny thing for me as a coach is, having studied physics and how the universe works, at its root, the universe is built on uncertainty. There's no such thing as certainty. No, there's absolutely no such thing as 100% certainty. Everything either has high levels of uncertainty or lower levels of uncertainty. That's all we're built to work with. Human beings are actually not designed from the biological level upwards, physical level upwards, to cope with certainty. We're actually designed to manage uncertainty. And as soon as we help clients in a coaching situation better manage uncertainty, often that's when they acquire new agency, new freedom, and they're able to cope better with the sticky, messy situation of their life. But also, uncertainty is really important when it comes to having room to breathe, having wiggle room. Because if your life is fixed and it's challenging in unnecessary ways, and you want things to change, and there's no uncertainty, nothing's going to change. But if there's some uncertainty, at least there's some wiggle room for you to do something that could be different than in the situation that you're currently in.
And I'm interested in that, partly because when you talk about the complexity of relationships, and it would appear demographically that more and more of us are living a more singular life. We don't necessarily predominantly live in multi-generational homes and quite close communities. We can have friends who are literally the other side of the planet, and we may well identify with them as our friends more than the next door neighbor. So there is that split. And I think managing that number of relationships, we're familiar with the Dunbar number that says pretty much tribes fragmented at about 150. The technology has allowed us to keep in contact with way more than 150. But I think if we're managing that, maybe that's perhaps one of the contributory factors to burnout and stress and anxiety. And whilst I absolutely agree, I think we thrive better with a degree of uncertainty because it gives us choice. The human mind is heuristically wired for shortcuts. And anyone who's read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, will be familiar with those quick fixes, those sound bites, those 3-point plans, those simple recipes that can guide us to entirely the wrong conclusion. And which, of course, marketeers love and politicians use, and the power of language to make things simple and hide the messy complexity of reality. So I'm really quite interested in how we manage complexity in a world where we're constantly trying to simplify things down to microwave food.
I'd put it down ultimately to working with one thing,
Mhm.
and that is what I described as necessary uncertainty.
Mhm.
There's something else as well called unnecessary
Mhm.
uncertainty. That's not helpful at all. Okay, it's going to waste a lot of your energy, and you're going to be dealing with a very VUCA kind of volatile, uncertain kind of experience of the world, and it's not going to help you grow you, empower you, or anything like that. That's an unnecessary kind of uncertainty. It's just noise. It
Mhm.
doesn't have any data buried in it in one form or another. But then there's necessary uncertainty. Necessary uncertainty allows us the wiggle room to be creative, to think differently, to feel differently, in essence, for us to have freedom. And when people talk about degrees of freedom, that's really what I think necessary uncertainty facilitates. It
Mhm.
allows you some mobility in your consciousness, in who you're being, and for you to exercise the ability to be creative with your purpose, for example. Now, on the other side of the fence, there is certainty. But
Mhm.
again, there's two kinds of certainty. There's necessary certainty,
Mhm.
and then there's unnecessary certainty. Sometimes you can be really certain about something, but actually it's getting in the way.
Mhm.
It's fixing you and preventing you from evolving, because you're so sure, you're in a state of dogmatic being, if you will. And
Mhm.
actually that leads you to get in your own way and even possibly lose your way because you're so fixed. So there are two kinds of things that people have to work with in coaching for me. They're either going to be working with uncertainty, or they're going to be working with certainty. And they're either going to be working with unnecessary uncertainty, or they're going to work with necessary uncertainty. And similarly, unnecessary certainty and necessary certainty too. So you could almost put it into like 4 quadrants, if you will. But there's only, for me, only one thing that you need to be working with overall, whether it's certainty or uncertainty. You need to work with what's necessary. It doesn't matter whether it's certain or uncertain. You need to get a feel for what's necessary in a very kind of Sherlock Holmes kind of way. Once you removed all the things that are unnecessary, you're just left with the necessary. However bizarre or impossible that may seem, that's what you're meant to be working with. And the big challenge, especially in modern times, is to become mindful enough to remove the unnecessary so that you're only left with the necessary. And it's a very Eastern perspective that sometimes you can't define something in terms of what it is. You can only define it in terms of what it isn't.
Mhm.
So you spend a lot of time connecting to all the things that something isn't. And then when you've discovered what those are and you remove them, whatever's left, whatever impression you have left, is what that thing actually is. And in coaching, that's really, really important. Sometimes you just can't describe something in terms of what it is, but often, even including in new dating circles now, people meet each other according to what they hate, according to what they don't like. And it seems to generate more affinity between them than what they like. A common kind of hatred or a common dislike, it's often something that is a surface level projection of a deep passion, a deep kind of alignment people actually have. And
But
in
they tend
coaching,
to be they tend to be, I suspect, alliances rather than friendships. My enemy's enemy is my friend.
well, my coaching practice, there's 3 principles in it which I use in my AI.
Mhm.
And they're actually based on principles that most people will probably be conscious of. that they would have experienced when they were at school. I've discovered that when you're at school, you're likely to have three kinds of friends. You like to have friends who support you, are very similar to you, and socially you'll get on with them, you like them a lot. But you're not likely to learn from them because you're very likely to have the same weaknesses as well as the same strengths. So in which case, you might need to have another kind of friend who's opposite to you. And you might not like them, but you'll potentially learn a lot from them and they'll learn a lot from you because one person will have strengths where the other one's got weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And then there's a third kind of person who is kind of a mix of similar and opposite qualities. And they tend to be really good sounding boards. They tend to be good to go to for reflection. And they won't necessarily support you or challenge you, but they'll help you contemplate and think through things. And it turns out those three things, support, challenge, and reflection, they're critical for growth. Mm-hmm. And I describe those three things as social vitamins, because just like with a normal vitamin or vitamin, if you don't get something like vitamin C for a day, it tends not to be a problem. But if you don't get vitamin C for 3 months or 6 months, it's going to affect your growth. It's going to cause harm for you. Strangely, it's the same thing with support, challenge, and reflection. If you don't get support for a day, not really a big deal. If you don't get support for months or years, it will undermine your growth. Same thing with challenge and reflection. If you don't get challenged on a particular day for something that you should be doing differently, it might not be a big problem unless it's a critical time. But if you go throughout your whole life and nobody challenges you on anything you're doing, or nobody stops you to get you to reflect on something, you're going to find you get to middle age and you look around and go, what am I doing here? How did I end up here? You know, so these are things which, just like with vitamins, you know, you can get vitamins from different sources. You can get them for different qualities. If you're really lucky, you might find a superfood which has got all the vitamins in it. And it's the same thing with people. You might be lucky enough to find someone who can support you, who can challenge you, and help you reflect at the right times. But the worst thing to have is to actually have someone who gives you those things at the wrong times. They support you when they should have challenged you. They challenge you when they should have supported you. And they get you to over reflect when you need to act, or they get you to the opposite. They don't allow you to reflect enough and you end up rushing into action. Typically those people, they end up becoming your worst enemies. And if you do that with yourself, you become your own worst enemy. You get in your own way and you lose your way. But those people who are able to support, challenge, and reflect at the right times with the right doses from the right sources, they're the ones who get out of their own way and find that way. In coaching, I spend a lot of time trying to help people to support themselves at the right time, challenge themselves, and to reflect at the right times. And when they do that, it's literally like getting vitamins. They start to feel nurtured. They start to feel more alive and more vitality, and they feel like they're growing. And that's ultimately the kind of feeling, if you like, I love my clients that end up in knowing that they've got what they needed in order for them to nurture their soul, nurture their potential, nurture their purpose.
I'm interested in exploring that further. I can see the value in that, but I can see two directions that we might go in. One is that, you know, the HR department of organizations is meticulous with its recruitment, selection, and talent acquisition, such that it has the perfect mix of all those ingredients, and it knows that its product is to manufacture cake, okay, and it has all the requisite ingredients to do that efficiently and effectively. Now, first, that's not going to happen because whilst it may be a great ambition and certainly worth pursuing, you know, we don't have such perfect resources nor access to them. So then inevitably you have the team that you have. How do you manage that situation where there perhaps isn't the perfect blend of relationships? Do we structure teams differently, or do we educate people within the teams to behave differently?
Well, when I look at those vitamins of support, challenge, and reflection, when I first put together the AI, which would help a person discover what area of their life they need to support, what area do they need to challenge themselves on, what area they need to get reflection on, One of the things that came out of that was realizing that those vitamins might not necessarily come from themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They might come from another human being.
Mm-hmm.
And certain clients said, could we meet up with the other clients that you've got
Mm-hmm.
so that we can, because we all work with the vitamins, that we can all kind of nurture each other. And so what I did was I wrote some algorithms which matched people according to whether they were similar, opposite, or that mix, so that they could give each other support, challenge, and reflection. So they could find that source of help in another person. But then I thought, hang on a minute, people can get support by listening to some music.
Mm-hmm.
It can be challenged by watching a film
Mm-hmm.
or reflect in reading a book. So there are lots of sources in the world for support, challenge, and reflection. The person doesn't necessarily need to rely on themselves or even rely on other people. The question is, for a given need, what does that person need in terms of support, challenge, and reflection? What proportions do they need? And then the other thing to look at is, in their relationship with somebody else in the team, what support do they need? What challenge does that relationship need? And what reflection does that relationship need? Okay. Now, the highest level of this is, if you, and I did this with women entrepreneurs who worked in groups over 3-month programs. I helped them to get support, challenge, and reflection for themselves as individuals in the first week or two. And then towards the end, the women would be matched to each other according to whether they're similar, opposite, or complementary, and get that support, challenge, and reflection. But there'll be 6 or 7 of them, or maybe a dozen of them. And then they all have to be matched with each other in order for the team and its purpose to be supported, for it to be challenged, for the team to be able to reflect on what was actually being called for. So that scaled way of doing things, where the individual is given the support, challenge, and reflection they need from whatever source, whether it's from themselves, whether it's from other people in the team, or something on the internet, a piece of music, whatever. Then you go up to the next level, where each day they're matched the best person that's going to give them a mutual support, mutual challenge, and mutual reflection. It has a knock-on effect on the dynamics and the fields of consciousness for the whole team. But the AI was smart enough to combine people's profiles together and identify for a given person, right, how do you compare with the team? I actually looked at each individual and said, are you the best person out of everybody in the team to support the team? Your consciousness, your nature is the most similar to the collective consciousness of the whole team. So that person would become the champion for supporting everybody that day, for the whole team, for the team's purpose. And then there'll be somebody else who could challenge the team, who would be the devil's advocate. And there'll be somebody else people could go to for reflection and sounding out things. Sometimes, if you were really lucky, you'd end up with one person who had the highest average score, if you like, across all those territories. And they will be the best team leader for that day. And this is really useful in agile environments, where you don't need to have a fixed leadership or architecture or hierarchy. So in each meeting, you would find that there's a specific person who's best to lead that team on that day. But the beauty of this is that everybody's got something to contribute. And also the team as a whole can support that individual. The team as a whole can challenge an individual. The team as a whole can contribute reflection to that individual. So even when you don't have the perfect teams, the AI finds the best source of support for any given individual from the rest of the team, but it's always mutual, because the team as a whole can be supported by one individual, and the team as a whole can support back to an individual too. And when you see those dynamics at work, the energy, the relationships, it's a very unique, high fidelity kind of exchange that contributes to sustained creativity and problem solving.
I'm interested how much you are the facilitator for that, or what work is done to enable the team to facilitate themselves through that. Because I can see that that is a wonderful organic and dynamic process, but I imagine it takes some nurturing, some practice.
No, that was the strange thing. When I was working with women, and over the years, I must have worked with about 100 women entrepreneurs in that particular organization, typically in groups of around 7 to 12 women at a time over 3 month programs, working with the technology on a daily basis, where they were getting profiled each day and identifying their priorities and being matched to each other. It wasn't complex at all, because once people knew what their own priority was for the day, and they were matched to someone who was similar to them, then two people who are similar might, for example, both be logically oriented that day. Two people who are opposite to each other, one might be logical in how they're thinking, that's their kind of orientation. The other one might be intuitive, for example. And they could read from the descriptions that would come up, right, this person is my opposite, this is my challenger today. And they know what to do. They know that with that person, they've got to push them, they've got to stretch them, they've got to be devil's advocate for them. And usually it's mutual.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was similar, they need to support each other. If it was complementary, they need to be there for helping contemplate things with one another. But the point is, there's only three things to do. So you can do it with another individual, you can do it with yourself, or you can do it collectively as a team. And because there's only three things to do, everybody knows, right, with that person, I have to reinforce what's happening for them. I have to have their back. With that person, I have to really challenge them and look at how can they do things differently and not do the same thing over and over again. And with this person, I don't need to try and change them. I just need to help them think through something and reflect and contemplate on something. And those are the only three behaviors required. And once you've done it for yourself, once you've done it with another person, and it's easy then to do it collectively as a team. And it doesn't need to be mediated, because when you see the data come up and you know how you're connected to somebody and what kind of dynamic you're meant to engage with them, after doing it for just 2 or 3 days, everybody intuitively, instinctively just knows how to engage with somebody else in the group, but also how to engage with the group as a whole. And lastly, how to allow the group or the team to actually nurture back that individual as well. So there's a lot of dynamics involved, but there's only three behaviors. So it's incredibly easy to adopt and run with.
I can see that that might work in a organizational team where there's a degree of autonomy about how you structure work and there is a common goal. So I actually work with high performance rowing teams, and I could see that that would work brilliantly in that context. But in those contexts where we don't necessarily have a common goal, and that may be the case in actually quite a few organizations where there is a tendency to specialize, and that specialism creates fragmentation. We don't have generalists over whom we can bounce off each other. We tend to specialize to the point where we are separated by language and understanding, and that can be really problematic. So what are the contexts where this works really well, and what are the contexts which may be more challenging, and what do we need to do about that?
Having agency to relate with people in a way that's called for is really important.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the agency or you don't have the access to people, then it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to work. So when these programs are done from the outset, it's established that each person has the right to access another person.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say, well, you're chief executive and you're only going to talk to the other executives. You can't say, well, you're only on the shop floor, you can't talk to executives. No, nobody is out of bounds. Mm-hmm. If the next thing that could change your life could come from a janitor and you're the CEO, are you really going to miss that opportunity? Mm. Are you really just going to wave it to one side and go, no, I don't want to listen to somebody that low? Or are you going to realize the potential and the value and the intelligence and the wisdom that's capable of arriving from anywhere? Now, when you're open to that, it's interesting how you actually end up being exposed to more and more wisdom. And you start finding, in a synchronistic kind of way, more and more of the things that you were looking for your growth just seemingly turning up in your space. And it's an energy thing. It's a space and time thing. And with a lot of my clients, they remark on strange synchronicities or coincidences that happen in their life. And I have to say to them, it's not luck. What's going on is an alignment going on in space and in time and in mind. When you get an alignment in space, time, and mind, a coherent connection between those three things, if it happens in space, two things coincide in space, you get a coincidence. When two things synchronize in time, you get a synchronicity. Now, when you get synchronicity and a coincidence together, that's called serendipity. And there seemed to be a ever increasing frequency of serendipity. The more and more people were coherently aligned to one another based on the support they needed, the challenge they needed, and the reflection they needed. You got dissonance when someone who needed support was challenged, when someone who needed challenge was colluded with and supported, when someone needed reflection but they were rushed into action, or someone needed to act and they were over contemplating something, over ruminating something. Those were all the things which led to a disrespect for conservation of energy. And the most fundamental law in the universe is the law of conservation of energy. You disrespect that, you can pretty much bet inertia will end up eating you up and preventing you from going forwards in life with any kind of flow.
So one of the preconditions then has to be an openness. And, you know, with DISC, Myers-Briggs, or any of the other sort of personality profiling type things in the past, certainly there are some people who would proudly put a poster on the wall and say, this is me, this is how to talk to me.
I am MFJ, I am into, yeah, they can do that.
Yeah. But there's a good percentage that would rather hide that and say, I don't want to be psychoanalyzed, I don't want to be dissected, or etc. I can see the value, but it really does demand quite a lot of trust. How do you manage that?
Well, in the first instance, for example, the women that I was talking about, in the first week that they work with the technology, they don't use the AI at all. What happens is that selfie image comes up, which shows where they're doing well with their needs, where they're not. And it's directly a paint by numbers thing that could equally do on a piece of paper with some paint. Okay, so they trust that completely because it came from them and it's just their scores turned into colors. That's all it is. And what happens in that week is I ask them to look at that like they're looking at themselves in a mirror and say, right, do you see anything that's out of place? If it is, you can adjust it. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You make a judgment call for yourself on what is out of place or what needs attention, and you go attend to that. And they learn over a week or two to build up a radar for what needs to be worked on and what can be afforded to be left alone. Now, in the second week, I get them to use the AI to determine what their priorities should be. It looks at all the needs and figures out the center of gravity and says, this is your central need for today, that everything else should revolve around. And what they do is they do the same thing as they did before. They look at their life, make their own judgment call on what they think, what their preference is for what they should work on. And then they look at the AI and what the priority is that it recommends. And then they look at the two. They look at their preference and they look at the priority and see, is there an alignment between these two things? And what happens in the coming week is they learn when they followed a particular preference, whether it worked out for them or not. They learn when they follow that priority, did it work out for them or not, better or worse? And usually they find out the priority that's recommended tends to be more aligned with who they authentically are. And it tends to conserve energy better than the preference that they chose. So they learn to trust through direct experience and validation and testing over that coming week. So I never assume that they're just going to jump on board and go, woo, I'm going to get some super advanced intelligence to give me some, you know, razor sharp wisdom on exactly what I should work on. No, go through it as an experience. And then eventually people who've been using it for a long time, they fine tune their own radar. And there comes a point where they don't need the AI anymore because they can do it themselves. Their preferences now align to their priorities. The biggest mistakes most people make is that their preferences are not in alignment with their priorities. And
Mhm.
that's usually when they end up wasting a lot of energy. But the moment people align those two things, that's when a person starts to get out of their own way. And the technology is just a crutch.
Mhm.
It's just helping them while they heal that break in connection between what they prefer and what their real priority and purpose is in life. As soon as that's healed and that bridge has been built, you don't need the technology anymore because you've internalized it, you've
Mm.
encoded it. And often with the women I've been working with, I've had to say to them after 3 months, you don't need this anymore.
Mm.
You've internalized it. You know how to support yourself, challenge yourself, and reflect. And you've got sensitivity of what other people can do with you as well and how you can help them. And
Mhm.
once you've got to that stage, you don't need the AI anymore. You don't need to, and this is my big kind of flag that I like to wave, which is if AI isn't advancing our own consciousness and we're busy trying to make it cleverer than we are, that's the wrong way to go.
Mhm.
You know, it has to be where we are advancing the AI so that we can advance our own consciousness
Mhm.
to the point once where we no longer need the AI anymore because we can advance our own consciousness all by ourselves. You
And
know,
I think that's particularly interesting, poignant, and important because we're increasingly living in a world where perhaps we try to be something that we're not. Either we follow role models or career ambitions or societal norms, and norms is a very challenging phrase to use, or expectations, or any of those things. I wonder what percentage of people actually don't even know who they authentically are, and how this might have an impact and effect. Have you had experience of people in those types of circumstances?
well, the AI, people who use it builds a map for people to discover who they really are. So, for example, um, the number of needs that get assessed, a person scores themselves on, and that the scores are eventually turned into colors. There's 30 of them. There's 5 needs according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, mental, physical, emotional, those kind of things. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got 6 emotional and social intelligence factors to do with self-awareness, self-regulation, those kind of things for a person's own emotional intelligence and how they are with other people. And when you actually look at that and you see the grid, it's something that ultimately facilitates a discovery of which need. You can put weights on each of these things. You can physically have a grid and put some weights in it, and if you can hold it in just the right spot, it will be balanced just
Mm.
under the need that happens to represent the center of gravity of all your needs. You can physically do it, right? You don't need a computer or anything to do it. And that need is the priority for that day. It's the purpose for that day.
Mhm.
Now, let's say if you did that day after day and you tracked which needs seem to come up frequently, eventually you'd end up with a kind of a histogram, a two-dimensional histogram, and you could find out where the center of gravity has been of all these priorities that have emerged over the last 3 months. And you'd find wherever that center of gravity is of
Mhm.
all those priorities, that is where the person is trying to deep down center themselves.
Mhm.
That's what they're trying to serve. That is their locus. That is their pivot. That is the center of gravity of their consciousness that they're trying to facilitate and serve. And when I show people the image building up over time, and they notice that a particular area is coming up with a color that represents the highest score for the area that seems to be repeatedly oriented around, they're beginning to develop this felt sense that that's what they always knew.
Mhm.
And this is just a visualization of it.
Mhm.
And it doesn't even necessarily involve AI, because remember, they could just as well be doing this with something physical. And when someone discovers the center of gravity of their being and which need is it that they've got to work on serving on a daily basis for the general context of their life, then they found probably what they need to build values around. When someone has a clear set of values that they orient their life around, that form the center of gravity of everything they do, So long as they put energy into that, like supporting the center of gravity of anything, like I've got, I've got a mouse here. If I support it under its center of gravity, it's stable. If I support that anywhere else, it's going to fall and collapse and become unstable. It costs lots of energy to try and maintain. But when someone finds the center of gravity of all their needs and they build values around it and they go and support that with their energy and intention and attention, their life, their mental health, their consciousness stabilizes. And you can only build things on things which have stable foundations. If you try and build on something that's unstable foundations, it's really hard to grow anything at all, especially your consciousness or your own life. So the secret, a lot of the time, to helping people discover who they are is simply find the center of their gravity of their needs each day. And over time, typically they tend to gather and cluster around a particular need. And the reason is because all those needs are trying to answer to that one need. And that tends to be linked to their life purpose. It tends to be linked to their authentic nature and character and soul and spirit, if you like. And with AI, it's possible to track and map that and identify where it is. And then once you've got that information, you don't need that anymore. You could come back to it a year later, just do a kind of temperature check if you want to. But once you have that, typically, if it's right for you, you'll feel it. You'll have that felt sense which says, I really, absolutely, definitely can see that that's what it is. I just didn't have the data to realize that's the need that all my other needs are trying to serve. But when you have it done courtesy of AI in that digital way, as soon as you've made the discovery, people typically don't want to work with the AI anymore because they don't need to. They now know where their center of their being is, who they need to be, and what it is that they're trying to serve. And from that moment onwards, their intuition, their instinct is all they need to keep themselves on that path.
Well, look, this has been a fascinating, enjoyable, really interesting and insightful conversation. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I said right at the top of the podcast we would share your TED Talk because that provides a little bit of an introduction. But if people want to find out more, if people want to dig deeper, what would you recommend? What would you share? What should we provide perhaps part of this podcast, or where could people go to find out more about you, your product, and this way of thinking?
Well, certainly look at me on YouTube. I find lots of videos where people have interviewed me for other subjects, but a lot of them will be about consciousness and purpose and transformation, and they might provide different perspectives and angles. There's my website that I've been doing my coaching through over the last 16 odd years, and also doing before it became a website as well, and that is energydiamond.com. So if you go to that website, energydiamond.com, you'll see the background to the artificial intelligence coaching platform I created and how it's a blend of East and Western principles of science and development, and also testimonials from people who've used the technology before. And there's a video there as well that someone did of me talking about this kind of stuff alongside of other transformational leaders in the world. If there's one thing I'd suggest that you watch on YouTube, there's a video which is called Awakening. At what stage are you at? And when I first posted it, I think I was doing a podcast with about a dozen people, just talking about different states of consciousness that people have to be worked with in coaching. And there are people who are sleepwalking through life, if you like. There are people who are awake. And I was talking about different levels of awake, how awake people are. And when I first put it up, I think it had a couple of hundred views or something. And then I got a little message from YouTube saying someone had made a comment on it. And I went back and looked at it at 70,000 views. And then a little while later, I noticed that about 140,000 views. I'm thinking, whoa, what happened here? How did this all blow up, And I think this is what a lot of people are searching for. They are searching for two things. One, they want to know how awake they actually are. What level of wakefulness are they in? Are they sleepwalking through life? Are they absolutely sedated and drugged up and no matter how much you pinch and punch them, they're not going to wake up to what's really going on in life? or are they genuinely awake? There are people who are awake, but they're bedridden. They know what's going on, they communicate with people, they understand stuff, but they just don't have the agency to look after themselves. They need other people to run around and look after them. But the moment someone finds their legs and gets around with regards to their consciousness is when they can start really making a difference for themselves and for other people. So that video, Awakening, what stage are you at? It covers the 6 or 7 different levels of wakefulness that you need to be aware of. And you can't really collaborate with people unless you're awake. You can't get around a table and make plans if you're sleepwalking. You have to look at each other eye to eye and acknowledge each other and be able to have a conversation. And there are lots of things in there where I talk about indicators of whether someone's sleepwalking. For example, an indicator of someone who might be awake, but they haven't found their legs yet. And if you're going to go out into the world and make a difference for yourself and other people, it's really important to have a radar for how awake people actually are and what are the indicators, so that you can navigate your way, hopefully, through to the people who are awake and avoid the sleepwalkers and the people who are completely anesthetized with regards to reality. So do check that out. So energydiamond.com is the main site. Check out Awakening, what stage are you at? And with regards to my current work, it's to do with the AI Coaching Alliance, which is looking at how AI can best be adopted into coaching practices. And you'll find more information about that on aicoachingalliance.com.
And I will include links to all of those in this podcast description. This has been fantastic, and I actually look forward to a follow-up in due course. But in the meantime, a big thank you very much indeed for what has been insightful, enjoyable, and fun.
Yeah, it's been I'm really honored to have been able to plant seeds today with you in this very fertile soil. And I look forward to seeing what things bear fruit in the future.
Thank you.